This video is going to take a look at adding objects into STK. Now, many of our challenges and scenarios will actually come with a pre-made VDF with all the important features actually added, but it can still be very useful to be able to add something else. Maybe try adding a new satellite and see what it does, or a different ground station to collect some information that is not necessarily part of the pre-made file. We're going to start off by looking at the most common things to add, that is satellites and ground stations, but we'll also, as this video goes on, take a look at adding some more of the other standard features that you might see in some of our scenarios. So this might be a little bit longer of a video, but odds are good you'll get the majority of what you need here at the beginning, and you could check one of the later parts if you were looking to add, say, a sensor or an area, which might be part of a more advanced scenario. So let's get started. We've got an STK scenario loaded up here, a nice simple one where I can just add a lot of the basic functions, and so it's not actually designed around any of our individual challenges. I'm going to go in and add a few things into our scenario. Now, one thing to note about adding objects, it's very helpful over here in the object browser, as we will see with some of these things, that they must be added in specific spots. Now, right now there's nothing in my scenario, so all I can click on is the scenario itself. Now, there are a couple ways that you can go about this. We can do insert, we can do default object, or from standard object database. Myself, I usually like to do default object. It comes up with a nice, just straightforward list where everything is kind of all together, but there are some other ones. When you first load the scenario, it'll ask you to add something in a slightly different format where it'll separate out parent objects from subsystems that could be put in there. Okay, let's get started. Let's start off with a facility, a ground site. So I'm going to select the facility and I'm going to click Insert. What I like about this approach is it goes ahead and just inserts it with pre-programmed information, pretty much always starts it back up over here. Looks to be in New England off the top of my head. So this is just marked facility. I'm going to make this a common location for our classes, and we're going to take a look at a high school in Oklahoma. Now, that's going to be back over here instead of on the East Coast. But luckily, I've looked up online and gotten the information that I need for the proper location of this high school. So I'm going to go over. I'm going to bring up by right-clicking on the high school itself and going to the basic parameters. Now here, I've got a spot where by default I can put in latitude and longitude. Now I've looked it up. The latitude is 35.669058 technically. So I'll go ahead and put that in. I've got a few more significant figures down to the arc minute, but I think we'll be okay. And it's actually at negative 97.484872. I'm going to go ahead and select Use Terrain Data for the altitude. The building isn't that tall, so we don't have it up like on a gantry or down in a well or anything like that. But if you had a structure there that maybe whatever the map terrain is, you've actually got your receiver maybe up on top of a big high antenna, maybe you'd want to uncheck this box and adjust that. You could also do height above ground, among other things. So I'm going to click Apply. For this, I just want to show you the basics in how we can adjust the latitude and longitude and physically locate our target. So we've got, that should be right about where our ground site is. Okay, so that's adding a facility. You could also go in and add things like a target, which is like a facility, but STK will just treat it as something that you can't add additional stuff to. It's just a location to look at. In this case, ground site is probably going to be the main place that we would want to do, as we'll see in just a minute in our video, because then with a ground site, we can do things like add receivers onto it. But one of the other things that we're probably going to need is a satellite. Now, you probably don't have to do this as much, but whenever I'm adding something broadly to it, to just the scenario itself, I'll come back over to the object browser and left-click on the scenario. Our basics one is what I've called this one. I'm going to do Insert, once again, default object, or let's try the other, Insert New. Here is the list that usually comes up. Now, I do want to add a satellite. I could have done it from the simpler list that we saw just a moment ago. We've got scenario objects and, like I said, attached objects. Attached objects are things that you can't just add into the scenario. You've got to put them onto an existing other thing. But I want to add a satellite. Now, by default, it comes over here from standard object database, and if you try and insert from that, it allows you to actually pull in pre-made stuff that can be really, really useful. You could also do things like Orbit Wizard or a bunch of different options, but the one that I find most useful is actually the define properties. If you do it this way, you basically end up with the exact same setup that we had just a moment ago, except it saves you the step of having to right-click on satellite 3 and go to the orbit information. Now, in this case, propagator by default comes up as 2-body. You might try and double check what the appropriate propagator for your scenario is. It is often, for our challenges, J2 perturbation. Now, I don't want to get into great detail about different propagators, but if you do not have that set to what it should be, then the numbers you get from it will not necessarily reflect the results that you want. By default, we have the classic orbital elements, the semi-major axis, eccentricity, inclination, and so forth. A common thing to do, however, is to change it to the apogee altitude and perigee altitude. All right, great. I'm just going to leave these as the default. It seems to have loaded it in at an altitude of 300 kilometers, orbital inclination of 28.5, and zeros across the board for the other items. I'm going to click OK, apply, and then we've got our satellite. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give that a name. I can come back over here. I did that with the ground site. I may have done that very quickly. Left-click once, it'll turn blue. If you left-click again after a short pause, you can then type over it. I'm going to call that ISAT. Okay, great. So we've added a satellite. Now, these are kind of the basics on it. If your satellite has very specific information, you can come back in, properties. Maybe it starts off at an altitude of 600 kilometers. I can change that out. And maybe it starts off with an orbital inclination of 0 degrees. All right, looks like it's giving me the error on the apogee-perigee altitude. Whenever that happens, this may have shown up in a couple of my videos, but just do the drop-down, go to semi-major axis, then go back to apogee altitude, perigee altitude, and that should clear that error. It's an error that's showing up right now. Hopefully that'll date this video and they get it cleared up in the future. But STK is very complicated, complex system, so it's a ghost in the machine right now, is my understanding. Okay, so I can click OK, and now I've made it an equatorial satellite that's up a little bit higher than it was before. So you can go through and alter all those settings as you would like. So let's look at adding some subsystems. Now that was one thing that I had mentioned on this. If you want to add, say, a sensor, which is a common thing that we see in some of our challenges, I want to think about what object I want to add that subsystem onto. In this case, a sensor would likely go onto the satellite. So I have to choose from the object list which object I want to add the new sensor onto. And I can go down to Insert, Default Object, and I can select Sensor. Insert. Whichever object you have clicked on when you do the insert, when you're adding a subsystem, that's where it will add that subsystem. So you have to kind of think in advance and be mindful where you want to add that onto. In the outright, the new, I think you can actually select what object you'd like to add it to. So this isn't the only way of doing it, but this is the way that I and my students have found most useful. We'll call this iSensor. Okay, great. There are a lot of options on sensors. I'm going to show those real quick, but this is the sort of thing that might have a scanner or a camera. We can bring up our properties and our definition. By default, we usually use simple conic, but depending on what your scenario is, it may have additional information or matching a real-life scenario, depending on what you've got. Cone half angle. That describes if you measure from straight down how much of an angle, how wide it can actually see. So right now, 45 degrees half angle means we basically have a total angle in our triangle here, the cone I should say, not triangle, of 90 degrees, which is a pretty wide spread. That's a pretty open-ended sensor. I can narrow that down instead by making it maybe 15 degrees, and it becomes a narrower angle. We can see it's not nearly as wide. There are many pieces of equipment that might have a very, very narrow functional angle that they could use, maybe 5 degrees. Some of these I've described to my students as you're basically looking through a straw, and that can affect how you design your orbits. Okay, that's some sensors. We could also add onto the satellite a transmitter. Now, you may or may not see these. These start to get a little bit more advanced, but with our transmitters, we can go over to our properties, and we can adjust the frequency, and we can adjust the EIRP. Now, we could talk more about EIRP, but it's basically a good way of imagining it is it's how loud the transmitter is. So, it's measured in dBW, which are decibel watts. Now, the math with decibels can get a little bit tricky, but for the most part, we try and make it a little more straightforward for our challenge scenarios. In this case, the default loudness at the source is something that we could call 30 decibel watts. If I were to bump it up to 50 decibel watts, it would be much, much louder. In fact, way, way louder. But that's a way that you could imagine what this is. Now, transmitters are usually good if you're needing to do that analysis, but another thing that you might need to go with them, because they're sending out information, screaming at whatever loudness level they've got, volume if you will, but if it's really far away from what's trying to pick up that signal, well, it may still not hear it. And so that is where we can go over to, say, a ground site or something that's trying to get that signal, and we could do insert default object, and we could do a receiver. All right, so the transmitter is basically sending information out. It's talking real loud based on whatever your power settings are, but to make it louder, you're probably going to require more power, and maybe you don't have big enough batteries for that. On the ground site, you're going to have a receiver, and it's kind of like the ear. It will listen and hear things, and you can adjust how sensitive the ear is. So we could go in, and we could actually have it's checking whatever frequency, auto track, you could change that. You can also go in and start changing the different settings on here for the thresholds that it can hear. I'm not going to go into the great details on that. It'll come up a little bit more specifically in any of the challenge scenarios you need. One other thing that I'll mention, and will be related to another video that we'll probably take a look at in preparation for some of the advanced skills, you'll need a transmitter and a receiver to do something called a link budget, where you can actually check to see how well you are being received at the ground site, or sorry, the satellite is being received at the ground site. Basically, it kind of gives you an idea of how many dropped calls there are, for want of a better term, your signal bars, that sort of thing. All right, one of the last things that we're going to show in this video, at least, is we're going to take a look at adding an area. Now, insert, we could do the default object. Ooh. Good thing to note. Please note, I did insert default object, and my list is actually much, much shorter than it normally is. Why is that? Well, it's because I selected on the receiver. It will only show me things that I can add under the receiver. I want to go back and I want to add an area. Well, that would be onto the scenario itself. I don't want to add an area to my ground site, or my satellite for that matter. So I need to go back and click on my scenario, the first thing in the object browser. And that fills my list with all the stuff. So if you have a much shorter list, you might check where you've selected. Okay, let's go area target. I'm going to go ahead and do insert, and it's got a default one that it's put way back over here. Now, for area target, there's a lot of things that you can end up doing. One of the common ones that we'll end up using is, say, a boundary one, where you can add latitude and longitude. So basically, you can put in, and every latitude and longitude you do, let's see, 0, let's add another, maybe 10, oops, not 1 degree, sorry. There. 10 degrees, and let's go with 10 degrees. I'm going to add another. Let's go with 0 and 10. And then add another where it's 10 and 0. Okay. And now I should have something. Oh, I did them in a weird order, so I have a bow tie one. If you put them in a logical order, you'll actually end up with a square area there. But I'm going to go ahead and click apply because I don't want to get too caught up in this. This could be one where it may take a little while to manually put one in, especially if it's going to be a complex area. Or you may be able to import an actual file that might lay that out. There are area types, pattern, you've got ellipses, and so forth. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. One of the last things that I want to bring up on this, though, is showing you, here's a great place where adding something from a resource is actually going to be pretty useful. So let's go in with an area target, select countries and US states. So I'm going to go here. And in doing so, STK actually has a bunch of different common logical places set up. Well, our high school was actually in Oklahoma, so I'm going to go ahead and define the pre-made area for Oklahoma. And as we can see, they've actually gone in, and with that easy click, we've now got the area of the state of Oklahoma defined in STK. There are a lot of different countries and also US states, among other things. You can also go in, and as we showed, it may take a little bit of playing, but you'll be able to set up your own type of custom area as well. All right, so that's a broad overview without getting into too many details about the various objects that you might see in some of our challenges and scenarios.